bumbling detective has to hunt down a world-class jewel thief. That's basically the story, of course, of Pink Panther. I'm John Chang, again with Dan Edmonds.
Hello there.
And I thought about that, certainly we have a lot of different times we bring up different questions and themes and stuff like that. I just kind of want to recognize, of course, that right now, like kind of a pretty chaotic time here in the States. And, for me, I don't really, figure that we're ever going to solve the world's problems with our, film discussions and stuff. At the same time, though, certainly I feel that, one of the things that growing up that always was a great thing for friends and I to do and stuff, and where like kind of the differences kind of really started to drop and stuff like that was when we just shared, these stories behind movies and stuff, and talk about what they mean to us and everything. So that's kind of just, overall what I just wanted to kind of share, that like, I mean, if there's anything that we can do as, kind of, humanity, or like kind of, or even here in the States and stuff like that, is just, just ideally, spend more time, watching movies and sharing stories, and rather than kind of, looking at ways that, we are different, and, just basically pointing at the differences, or kind of, like basically, like kind of discriminating against each other because of those and stuff.
Well, I, of course, disagree, and I do think that our original versus remake talks are the key that will save the planet, possibly the universe at some stage. There's a thriller set in 1,000 years' time where, our YouTube videos will be the key piece of missing information to solving, a world-ending puzzle. Now, I mean, yeah, in terms of what these movies mean and things like this, and certainly we're all stuck at home, so there's a lot of kind of old favorite movies that we're watching. And I mean, for me, and probably for anyone from England of my kind of age range who may have sort of grown up in the 70s and 80s, the Pink Panther movies were pretty much a staple of any Christmas or bank holiday meal or anything like that. And there's this kind of thing where if you go into America and you generally insult Michael Jackson, you tend to get this, you're not going to make any friends anywhere, I think, in America. I think the same is somewhat true for Peter Sellers in the UK. If you come and say, I mean, he's so kind of like such a sort of comic icon, such a sort of, great sort of British actor in many ways, actually, that, he's very much put on a pedestal. I mean, he was completely insane from what I can gather, but but a genius nonetheless.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna have to talk more about that aspect too, about his comic genius / insanity and stuff. One thing I do want to kind of point out, it's not quite an elephant in the room, but the fact that the Pink Panther, the original movie, was really intended to be a vehicle for David Niven. So it's interesting how, Peter Sellers actually was intentionally, or the intent in starting out was that he was actually just a supporting character, almost like a minor one, and of course, as we see, watching this, that and never mind how things progress through the series, that totally changed and stuff. I think what happened too, apparently the story goes that on the ride of from the airport with Blake Edwards and Peter Sellers, that they basically recognized their love of Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton's comic, physical comedy. And so they realized that hey, we should incorporate some of that into the movie. So, what happened was that originally Peter Ustinov was supposed to be the detective that basically, supposed to be Inspector Clouseau, and Ava Gardner was supposed to be the wife, the scheming wife. And after she dropped out, apparently Ustinov also said, bye-bye and stuff like that. So Blake Edwards had to quickly find somebody who could, replace him and stuff. And so the rest is history, as we know.
Yeah, because I don't think, Peter Sellers had been in, I had a timeline, because it's kind of interesting, the timing of all this stuff. I mean, the movie I can think of that is obvious that was a big movie before that he'd been in was Lolita, as the doctor. Because it seems like there are certain, basically, well, there's two directors that seem to actually get on with Peter Sellers and were able to work with him, one being Blake Edwards and the other was Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah.
And Stanley Kubrick apparently loved Peter Sellers because he loved to do 100 takes. And he said with Peter Sellers, every single take would be different and most of them made him laugh, which was, a complete rarity of what he'd been working with. So, yeah, but before that, really, Peter Sellers had been in The Lady Killers with Alec Guinness, which was, and a few Ealing comedies and things like this. And I think it was his kind of union-based movie, It's All Right, Jack, was the one that, funnily enough, which is about sort of English trade unions, was the one that got him recognized in the States by certain directors because of his performance in that. But not anything major. This was definitely his first kind of big major movie that was going to a bigger audience. And you're absolutely right. He steals the movie from David Niven.
And the funny part too is that, like, the other part that, like, seems counterintuitive is that apparently he's actually not a physical actor. Like, in other words, until this, you really don't see any of the physical comedy that became more of his trademark and stuff like that. And apparently Blake Edwards was the one that, like, inspired the kind of Clouseau clumsiness and everything. Because apparently what was being portrayed on screen is actually Blake Edwards and how he would, like, himself get himself like kind of injured different, because there was an interview I was watching where he talked about, like, all these different injuries that he had on him, like a broken rib and all that. So this gets into the thing we've talked about before, that, like, sometimes things are staged so well that to look like an accident, but it really takes a lot of staging.
I'm sure, and I'm sure a lot of this stuff was rehearsed many, many times, and they did it. But the difference is, I think, is that Peter Sellers wasn't very keen on doing the same thing over and over again, and that's what made him one of the hardest actors to work with, apparently, because he tried to do theatre and he just didn't like that discipline of having to do the same lines, the same thing every night. And of course, he annoyed people in the theatre because he would sort of do ridiculous things like fall off the stage and do things like this to keep himself interested in the project.
Interesting.
And I'm guessing a lot of what you're seeing is a combination of Blake Edwards saying, okay, you're going to go and kind of trip over this and do that. And probably what happened was Peter Sellers would ad-lib various bits and the funniest ones probably got kept in there or made into something, because he was notoriously always sort of ad-libbing in various scenes. So, and you can kind of see from, if you've ever watched The Return of the Pink Panther in 1975, the leading lady in that, I can't remember her name now, English actress, but she's cracking up halfway through the movie. And they kind of say that, her character would have found him funny. But you can tell she's just cracking up because he's just doing he's probably just doing weird stuff. Like, there's this thing where he's like this kind of very 70s looking Lothario. He keeps doing this thing where he'll deliver a line and then he'll kind of squint his eyes like this very randomly. and every time he seems to do that, she just cracks up. It's very noticeable. So that was clearly something he just decided to throw in there just to sort of, keep himself amused.
Yeah, it's funny that you like kind of what's called that's the next time that Blake Edwards and he worked together again, even though I kind of, because the next movie within a year was Shot in the Dark, which is the return and the focus, or a return to the focus on Inspector Clouseau. And that was actually a rush job because, like, originally, like, Clouseau was not even a character in that movie, but they, like, kind of, apparently, like, the production on that one kind of, fell apart. So they quickly inserted Blake Edwards, but he did it only if, like, they agreed to let him, bring in Clouseau as a character. And so it was a rush job. And apparently after that, the two, Blake Edwards and Peter Sellers didn't really speak to each other again, for a while until Return of the Pink Panther. Like, kind of, like, they basically just had a falling out from the frustration of kind of, the different style and stuff like that, that you kind of, that on the one hand, the very thing that made them successful actually created such frustration, though, in the, that second project together.
Well, I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, obviously Blake Edwards had a very visual idea of how he wanted the comic scenes to play out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Peter Sellers can certainly perform and do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that process, but he probably either didn't want to do it or did it in a different way.
Right.
And eventually that different way probably was funnier. But,
Sure.
you know, I'm sure it was a very painful process to get there. Like I watched an interview with the leading lady who was in Pink Panther Strikes Back.
Mm-hmm.
And she said the routine was that they'd turn up on set and then basically Peter Sellers would kind of just amuse the crew for an hour and ad-lib stuff and not get on with shooting anything. And they maybe do like one scene possibly. And then it would be, you know, they'd have to come back and do it again the next day.
Wow.
But I mean, the thing is, Blake Edwards was obviously patient enough and able enough to pull out the best bits of that and put it into the movie. Because,
right.
I mean, it's funny. Critics love the Pink Panther, the original one, and Shot in the Dark as well. But I think comedically, the '70s ones are far funnier. I mean, the plots don't really make much sense in the '70s.
Right.
They do, but it's very loose.
Right.
So they're less kind of realistic. But the comedy is so much better because I think when you get to the '70s one, what happens is, like you said, Peter Sellers was not necessarily a slapstick comedian, but what he was surreal, and he dealt with absurdity a lot in his comedy. And what's clever about, especially when you see this more developed in the '70s one, is that, you know, he'll trip over something and then that will mean that he rips the pocket of someone's jacket. And then that will kind of like lead on to something else where he tries to kind of patch up the jacket, and then he spills something on the jacket. And then he takes the jacket off, and then you know, it just kind of goes on and on and on. And that's obviously, I'm sure that's a product of the direction plus the ad-libbing. And that becomes more kind of fluid and more absurd as you go on through the series in the '70s.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, basically, you know, that kind of comedy though. It's almost like I forget the name of the, you know, device and stuff like that, where it's like a Rube, I guess. You know, like it's basically like a you know, instead of like having a series of like kind of contraptions, right, that kind of creates you know, this mousetrap, whatever. It's like you have this, you know, comedy that's around like kind of, you know, series of these accidents of stumbling along and stuff like that to have that kind of same Rube effect.
Yeah. I mean, the difference, well, it's very much focused on the physical comedy in the '70s one, but the Pink Panther in '63 is almost like watching an old English sitcom, in that it's kind of who's going to get caught as they come out of the bedroom, and the other person comes into the bedroom, and they find them under the bed, or now he's got to run into the shower and he trips up over this, and it's all just focused on one room, which is what's really clever about it. All the different sort of interactions. I don't know what that's called either, but it's kind of fun and charming the way they do it in the original Pink Panther. But it's also got a lot of very interesting dialogue, and I think that's down to Blake Edwards starting as a writer, because I think he was predominantly a writer before he became a director, from what I understood anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
And the dialogue is very good. I mean, the whole scene, it's a very long scene, actually, much longer than I remembered, but between David Niven and the princess, this kind of jousting of egos and things. It's a really, really interesting scene. But I mean, it's totally out of character for a Pink Panther movie. And it's quite sort of, you know, I was watching it with my daughter because I thought, oh yeah, there'll be lots of slapstick comedy. She'll find this funny. And then there's kind of a thing where they're sort of drinking champagne and talking about the Virgin Queen, and I thought, oh dear, this is we're going to have some awkward conversations about this later. But yeah, it has a very kind of interesting conversational kind of quality to it, as well as this kind of gentle situational comedy kind of thing with Peter Sellers stealing the occasional scene with the slapstick comedy. And to testament to his performance, my daughter was basically just waiting for Inspector Clouseau to do something funny.
Right, I was going to say.
She was just sitting there, you know. It was, it really does punctuate that movie completely.
So I think for anybody who's like a fan of, you know, like the Pink Panther series themselves, this one stands out for that very reason, that like it's kind of very unlike like kind of the trademark, because never mind like kind of Peter Sellers like kind of being like more of a supporting role and stuff like that, but it really smacks of more like a spy kind of heist movie and stuff like that, where it's kind of comedy thrown in, and because like a lot of it is around like kind of the story of how David Niven's character is scheming to kind of and we kind of see like this the different layers of the scheme and stuff like that, and that's really like more the centerpiece, like kind of the plot to get this prize jewel right from this princess and stuff like that, and then of course like you said, like the seduction being like a key part of that and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it is multi-layered, and you know that seduction is really just a means to the end, but it's still quite effective, and it really gives David Niven a chance to sort of show you how charming and how good he is in that. But you're right. I mean, there can't have been many comedy heist movies before the Pink Panther, and I think it's also, this is where you see Blake Edwards' skill as a director across genres show through. And is very different from a lot of people that try and remake this movie, as we'll get into later. But other sort of variants of it, because he had actually directed thrillers and out-and-out romances. Those sequences within the Pink Panther that rely on creating tension are very effective. And likewise, the romance scenes are elements also work as well, because he's got that skill to know what sort of dialogue suits that, what kind of direction and shots work for a thriller. And I wonder, actually, I mean, I suppose Breakfast at Tiffany's was comedic, but again, it was kind of like that gentle situational comedy, not the kind of out and out slapstick. Like,
definitely.
I mean, I think he basically became one of the best slapstick directors on the Pink Panther, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's funny how like that's really what people remember too. Like when I think of Blake Edwards, I think of comedy and stuff, and then a lot of it being very much physical and stuff like that. But he's also like before all this, he was the director for the Peter Gunn series, which is very much like you said, like kind of the action oriented intrigue and quite a bit of romance and stuff like that. And it's also like part of that is this partnership with Henry Mancinii, which of course is the creator of this iconic music. Like, when we think of the Pink Panther, the music is just as much a part of the brand, if you will, or like kind of what we remember.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of film score, guys, in the top 10, Henry Mancini's got to make it in there somewhere. I mean, some of the most iconic theme tunes, just the ones for the Pink Panther themselves, are in a way up there. But he's just a great musician.
Absolutely.
But what I was going to say, you say, I mean, there are a lot of dissimilarities between the 1963 version and the ones that come later in the 70s. But there is one very important common theme, which is actually something you can see in a lot of Blake Edwards movies, regardless of the genre. And that is this thing that, if you'll notice, a lot of the locations are in very sort of high society, exclusive locations like Gstaad and places like this. And they revolve around millionaires and people who are very wealthy or well-connected. Like, the Phantom is Sir Charles Lytton. And so he plays with this idea of a backdrop of elite people and their locations and their playgrounds. And then what he does is he injects Inspector Clouseau as this kind of chaotic, absurd force as a way of, one, making fun of that, that sort of veneer of sophistication, and like, wouldn't it be funny if someone comes in and just trips over the tiger rug all the time? And in a way, he is kind of poking fun at that whole lifestyle, in my opinion. It's like, the absurdities of like the kind of social rituals, and and I think that's why so many of the Pink Panther movies are set in Europe, because of course that's where all of these kind of things are so well established compared to other places in the world. And so I think he loves playing with that, and making fun of people's egos, and having someone who's going to just squirt ink all over their shirt when they're trying to go on their way to the opera or something like this. That's
And,
very much his theme.
and definitely, like kind of, it's more, almost like Shakespearean, like kind of, this idea of like, lowbrow humor, right? In compared to like, kind of more sophisticated irony and, all those kinds of things and stuff. And so, in other words, having slapstick and stuff like that appeals more to kind of, what, which when Shakespeare would write about something that kind of appeals more to like kind of the common class and the people who bought the cheap seats, right? And meanwhile, you have like kind of the more sophisticated dialogue and things to kind of appeal to the higher class nobles and stuff that would attend his theater and stuff like that. And meanwhile, it kind of gives a little satisfaction when like Clouseau is like kind of had his hand stuck in this expensive vase, right? It's not a vase, it's a vase, and then and it shockingly breaks it like and that provides humor for kind of us commenters and stuff like that. But meanwhile, like kind of it's more shocking then because it's an expensive piece of art and stuff.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's something you see in SOB as well. His movie where he's sort of, I mean, that's one of the most interesting movies on Hollywood, I think, because it shows his take and his disillusionment on the Hollywood system.
Yeah.
And again, it's kind of this thing of pulling back the curtains on the playgrounds of the rich and the wealthy, and then kind of making fun of that and how ridiculous it is. So yeah. And I think, and apart from anything, it just makes the movies really interesting because they're just in really nice locations. You've got a sweeping Henry Mancinii soundtrack in the background. They're just really nice to watch in that respect.
I did want to say though that like I feel like kind of the original Pink Panther did have more of this sophisticated kind of Shakespearean kind of humor though too. And when I say humor, I mean it's has things like the mistaken identities and stuff. Because Clouseau is actually in the costume party is dressed as a knight, right? And meanwhile, his partner, the other gentleman, stuff like that, is dressed as the fool. So it's kind of like this. So it's kind of irony that kind of who's the fool, who's the actual knight and stuff like that. And I think that's what partially it makes Clouseau both endearing and also like funny and stuff. Is that like he really sees himself as like kind of has this desire to be kind of the hero and stuff like that, and he really sees himself as like kind of this super detective and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that is one of the key things about his character is that his own self-image is so removed from reality that we find it really funny. And the fact that other people, and this is one of the, I mean, you talk about Blake Edwards, apparently he had a very dark sense of humor, which is understandable. And, that's very much, in such a light movie like The Pink Panther, it's still very much there. Like Herbert Lom's character, which isn't really in, strictly speaking, the 63 one, but in A Shot in the Dark is when they introduce him. But this idea of, his boss is so tired of his incompetence that he wants to kill him. Because he can't kind of stand the fact that this, that someone can be this incompetent at life in general and have their self-image is so removed from reality that it's almost like, it's so sort of annoying for him that this person even exists. But, that's a very, I mean, in the Return of the Pink Panther, he's almost there trying to shoot him in the second scene. And that's pretty dark humor for a kind of like what's supposed to be a family-orientated comedy. But I mean, I guess that's the nice thing about Blake Edwards. It isn't necessarily family orientated. It just happens to be funny and not too offensive at the same time.
Right. Yeah, I mean that is a funny part as well. That like it almost seems like that's another transition because like you're saying how you watch it with your daughter and stuff like that. But if you take this original in face value, it's like probably like you would not think of like in other words, if aside from the franchise and stuff like that, this movie in itself, you probably would not think of as something to watch with kids and stuff. Never mind like kind of dialogue and stuff like that. But it just really it's pretty much very much I think adult oriented movie and stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah, no, absolutely. And it's really the 70s ones are, but I mean they're I don't know if they really count as particularly kid friendly in a way either, because I mean in the second one, Strikes Back, I mean people are getting shot fairly regularly and there's like a Russian spy who's sort of naked and seducing him, so it's really not even though it's very funny, it's still not, you know, a few more years yet for my daughter before she watches that one. But
the other thing I feel like, you know, that is kind of more, what's called, you know, similar like to what you're saying about like kind of darker stuff like that, is we do see like kind of like, you know, the different tensions and stuff like that, that like it's not necessarily, you know, humor per se and stuff, but just like kind of, you know, different times when, you know, Clouseau is trying to speak with his own wife and stuff. So it's kind of like this chase that kind of happens, you know, like kind of, it becomes comic, but that's actually like kind of, you know,
it's quite sad, really, isn't it?
You know, it's really like relatively like, you know, not very, I don't know, like it's yet another thing that like an adult appreciates, but I think it's like something that like, you know, it's not really comedy in the sense of excuse me, that like, you know, as we see, like you said, in the 70s, and then you know, just what the Pink Panther became more known for and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a more kind of relationship, touching on sort of romantic comedy area than anything that followed it, really. You're right. I mean, it definitely does. It's a more complicated movie, definitely, than the other ones. But yeah, I mean, yeah.
So I don't know if it's time to move on to the the remake, the 2000.
And that's going to be quite a painful experience anyway. So
Oh, no.
Well, the one thing I will say, the other thing, of course, apart from all the iconic stuff, is I can't think of many other movies where the opening titles are so good that they spawned an entire cartoon series purely based off them. You know, that is pretty amazing. That I can't remember the name now, Patty Freething, maybe. You know, the opening titles for the Pink Panther were so sort of good that they decided to make that into it.
Yeah, and the fact that like it's actually one of those, you know, title sequences that you want to watch then, because it's like you said, it's entertaining. Whereas, you know, like a lot of times, you know, people, most part, you know, if they could, they would fast forward through it. But most of the times, you know, as in the 60s and stuff like that, people just are sitting through it, right? Like kind of, but there's just kind of like, you know, waiting for like kind of, you know, getting to, you know, the actual movie and stuff.
But I mean, again, what's so clever about those is that, and it was very subtle in the 63 one, but they became the way that they kind of parodied different movie tropes and different movies in the opening titles. Like in, I think it's Strikes Back, it's got the pink, I think. And of course, this is even funnier because like Blake Edwards was married to Julie Andrews then. But it starts off with the Pink Panther spinning on a hill, like Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music, and then of like the dress drops away and he's just there kind of like, you know. So, you know, it's just, there's lots of stuff like that that's just really well done. And but the animation, the guy that directed the animation portion went on to do Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
The animation, the guy that directed the animation portion went on to do Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So yeah, but yeah, I mean, it's I think we're, you know, the other thing that we forget, well, the other point I wanted to make about why I think sort of Inspector Clouseau and Peter Sellers as him is so good is that, and why it works so well, is he has the ability to look convincingly surprised at his own actions. Like he will do something and he seems just as surprised as we are in the audience, and that is a remarkably difficult thing to pull off, I would say, in any kind of physical comedy. That's something that really I noticed. The other thing that that is very different with Blake Edwards is that he doesn't punctuate the comedy at all with music. He just lets a lot of the comic scenes just have background noise. There's no music at all. It's just the sounds of what's going on, which was something I noticed. So it means when the scenes change and you get the nice Mancinii score, it's very, very obvious sort of like difference. And he doesn't draw your attention necessarily to all the jokes as well. He lets you discover them in the scenes, which is another nice feature.
I did want to mention one other thing before we kind of move on is David Niven. We really see him in the sophisticated, con artist role, something like that, which we'll be touching on in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels in an upcoming episode and stuff like that. I feel like kind of somebody kind of really recognized the comic gold for him to be in that role, and so it's interesting also that like there's some award ceremony that they were looking to play the Pink Panther theme for him walking on stage, and he basically said not to do that because something to the effect that like that's not really my movie and stuff like that. So I think he kind of really recognized that like this was just like kind of a one-time thing for him. Although he did return again for one other of the other following versions of stuff.
Yeah, he wasn't in any of the Pink Panther follow-ups, but he did act again with Peter Sellers in Murder by Death, which was kind of their Clue spoof kind of movie with Alec Guinness.
And Casino Royale.
Of course, yes, a Casino Royale. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, yeah, which is obviously not one of Peter Sellers' high points, but
or David Niven's,
or David Niven's, really. But yeah, they did. I mean, the thing is, a lot of people said Peter Sellers was like Alec Guinness. He was like a younger Alec Guinness because he was so good at impersonating people. And this may be that's the thing. A lot of people know him from Pink Panther movies, but they don't realize just how good a mimic he was. He was incredibly good at doing impressions and could copy people's mannerisms, stunts, and styles. Really exactly. And in many respects, he was a very, very talented actor. But as I say, most people would just know him from Pink Panther.
Right.
So I mean, we really one last thing, right? But apparently, I was the way we touched on it earlier, but the gap in timing, because like you said, after Shot in the Dark, there was this huge gap where Blake Edwards and Peter Sellers didn't work with each other for almost 10 years. And what happened was, I think Blake Edwards was kind of on a downslope of his career.
He was, yeah.
And Peter Sellers was to some degree as well, because his reputation had obviously caught up with him. But he was fascinated by the book, which Being There was based on. And he got obsessed with this idea of making that into a movie, but nobody would fund it. So he made those last 3 Pink Panther movies purely as a way to fund Being There, which was kind of his legacy, or what he viewed as his legacy project. So, and he described himself as Chance the Gardener. He didn't feel like there was a Peter Sellers per se. It was just a number of personas that he played. Or he always described, I think in interviews, he says, people don't really want to talk to me, the real me, because I would just be too dull, So there's this feeling that he's always playing some kind of a character.
Yeah, I think that's really, for some of these actors, it really is their thing that they really do get lost in the role. So, like what you're saying about like kind of, that he would do something and surprise himself, because I think he's so in the moment that he is surprising himself, that like it's almost like kind of almost an out of body experience. And I feel like that's something that kind of really comes across, and like kind of and probably why like kind of that role really appealed to him, because that's probably the truest role to who Peter Sellers actually is and stuff like that. Whereas all these other ones are him playing kind of some kind of he's mimicking or playing a caricature that like is something that like he puts on just for that particular movie and role and stuff like that.
Yeah, and then, I'm also sidetracking this quite badly now, but but it's because I've watched a lot of stuff on Peter Sellers before I did this video. But the funny thing is, like Blake Edwards, another big movie of his was 10, which he was often described as being quite autobiographical. Now, in that story, if you actually look at the life of Peter Sellers, he got married. He was very much spoiled by his mother, and he was looking for that sort of mother type of woman a lot of the time. And his first wife, she said she felt very much like this sort of motherly role, and he would go away and kind of sleep with someone, and he'd come back and actually tell her about it on the idea that, oh, this is just my wife, she's like my mother, I can tell her about this stuff and she'll know what's going on. Awkward. And but funnily enough, in 10, Julie Andrews plays almost like a kind of a mother role to Dudley Moore in that movie.
Yeah.
And he describes it as autobiographical, but I do wonder if some of that is actually based on the character of Peter Sellers. to some
Interesting.
degree, or
Yeah.
maybe some sort of hybrid, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree also that, like it's, from what I understand also is that the character is also Blake Edwards in the sense of like, that it's this midlife crisis thing and stuff like that, right? And
Yeah.
so even though that like maybe he's not the one that like kind of was sleeping around and stuff like that, and so maybe that's like kind of where he combines like kind of the Peter Sellers aspect with his own kind of struggles with basically reaching midlife and everything. So yeah, I mean that's definitely something that may not be something that we'll be looking at and stuff like that, but it is an interesting aspect of the how just often we see like artists kind of bringing in different aspects of their life into their art and stuff.
Well, the industry being it is, not yet will we be doing
not yet, right. A remake of 10 coming up in 2024, I guess.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, I guess that's as good a segue as any to move on to the 2006 remake with comedy icon Steve Martin.
And also even, Kevin Kline. I mean, he's, somebody, like who I really thought, I know him from, of course, A Fish Called Wanda, and then just other, kind of similar movies where he's, a comic, genius in his own right and everything. But here we have two great comedic actors, and yet here we have this remake, right? That so I'll just kind of read off some of so rather than kind of us kind of basically being amateur critics and stuff, it was nominated for 2 Razzies for worst remake or ripoff, worst supporting actress for Kristen Chenoweth, as well as Stinker Bad Movie Awards for worst fake accent, both Steve Martin and Kevin Kline, worst actors Steve Martin, and worst song Check on It, which says a lot too to label a worst song when you have Beyonce singing and stuff. That's not an easy achievement.
No. Yeah, I mean, it was very difficult for me. I mean, I didn't even want to watch this remake because because I'm such a fan of the original Pink Panthers that I knew I was not going to be happy at any point in this movie. And also, I'm a huge fan of Steve Martin as well.
Right.
I mean, I love all of his stuff, and it almost it's like. God, it's like watching one of your favorite people being tortured, watching Steve Martin trying to get through the Pink Panther. It was, I mean, what got me was though that he wrote it or co-wrote it or something, which is really depressing. It's, that what it seems like, okay, so the structure of the original Pink Panther movies is that there are situations, things kind of blend into each other, the jokes roll on, like we talked about earlier. This one, it will jump from one joke here, they're then in a different location, and there's another joke here. And it's kind of like, it was almost like jokes by mind mapping. You kind of got the feeling that, okay, we're in France, what's funny about France? Okay, it's football. And then this, it jumped all over the place. There was no real kind of clever continuity between the jokes. It was just one very obvious joke. I mean, there were a few snatches of dialogue, interestingly enough, that I thought were actually kind of funny. And I'm guessing those were the bits written by Steve Martin, but they were very, very few. But it just shows you though, I mean, for people that may have not seen like the masterclass on Steve Martin, the guy is an incredibly intellectual.
Oh yeah.
And there's a huge amount of thought that even went into what seems like fairly simple humor of his early work. And he would rehearse that, many, many times to make any of the sort of physical or idiotic things seem more natural. He would just rehearse it until it seemed perfect. So this is not he wouldn't have gone into this without trying to prepare it as best as he could in whatever realm of control he had.
Right.
And you can tell that from those snatches of dialogue. That there's one where he's talking to Jean Reno's character. And he says, what's your part? And they said, I've been a police officer for for the last 4 years in the
Right.
Paris area. And he said before that, well, before that I was in the countryside. And then before that, he said, then my parents were police officers. And then before that, and it just kind of keeps, and that was actually kind of a funny moment.
Mhm.
But, it's going to take more than that to save this movie.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about all this is like the fact that like, here you have like good ingredients, right? Basically like, prime a, beef and stuff like that, like kind of, like filet mignon material and stuff like that. In terms of, the talent, in terms of, the budget and, production value and all that kind of stuff. But yet somehow I don't know, it feels like they chopped it up into hamburger and then, like burnt it and like kind of, to its crisp, like kind of, I mean, again, like, we have these strong actors you mentioned Jean Reno. I mean, we've talked about him, of course, from the Femme Nikita, and there's many other, like my personal favorite, of course, is kind of The Professional or like that he's a strong actor, and maybe he's not known for comedy, but he does it, like kind of he can pull off comedy in the right circumstances and stuff, and yet like it's just lost, like kind of and then we also didn't even mention Emily Mortimer, who actually I feel like she's actually one of the parts that make the movie somewhat work, in the sense of that like there's this kind of subplot of this kind of romantic tension possibility between her and Inspector Clouseau, and it's somewhat believable, like, because she's kind of like playing this shy assistant and stuff like that, and I feel like the reason why it works is that, from what I've kind of learned about Emily Mortimer, is that she really is like kind of very much a as an actress, like kind of just was starting to kind of come into her own, and and she in an interview talked about how like until like one a separate independent project where she kind of really bared her soul, but she always felt like she wasn't a real actress, and that like like kind of she didn't understand being hired for these relatively major productions and stuff, and usually as you can see, she usually is a supporting actress and everything like that, but she always felt like a fraud, that like this isn't a real job and I'm not a real actress and stuff like that. So and I feel like that vulnerability / kind of insecurity comes across, like she's being very genuine.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not a great part, is it? To be fair, it's kind
No,
of
no,
like
no,
some
no.
weird sort of semi-funny bit part,
Right,
love
right.
interest of a really weird, out of character Clouseau. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they took this kind of, but the thing, what they've done is they've done a kind of a half-hearted effort with that, because part of what was funny about some of the Pink Panther movies was that the women that were interested in him were, absolute bombshells.
Right,
why
right.
would you be interested in this sort of bumbling detective?
Right.
But she's a bit too normal. She's not really sort of, bombshell-like in her behavior to make that kind of contrast funny.
Yeah.
I mean, likewise, the other thing is that why did they have to go to the States? And for me, that was just kind of like a real cynical, we've got to market this to a US audience, so we have to have him in America, and he's got to sort of, this whole hamburger joke thing that they just hammered on and on and on, that just wasn't funny. And I mean, it was just, so terrible.
Yeah, I think overall that's what's kind of just the strange part about it is the fact that like, or how they try to force the humor, and as a result, what comes across though is like almost like you felt like there's either your clueless uncle or this your nephew that like really like kind of is just trying on stuff more kind of humorous like that. So again, you had all this talent, you had like kind of nice size budget and stuff like that, but yet it just didn't glue together.
I mean, they lost the whole kind of general theme of what the situation that Clouseau works in. At the end, you've got, no spoilers, I suppose, but they've got Jean Reno and Steve Martin dressed in skin tight, sort of like her dancing around stupidly, and it was just like, yeah, this is about as low as it gets, really. It's all gone, you know. And they're supposed to be at this posh sort of event. I can't remember what it was, an awards thing or something.
Right.
You know, if it was Clouseau in the original thing, he would have disrupted that event through a series of kind of accidents or done something. You know, it just wasn't even kind of characteristic of the.
Yeah, I think one of the telling things too of just what you're talking about is that you know, one of the classic you know, sticks, if you will, right, is when Clouseau, you know, would spin this globe, right, and then just kind of, you know, basically fall, you know, over himself. And they did that almost like an homage kind of thing to it. You know, like they had the globe, and so you kind of were almost anticipating it. And on the one hand, it's kind of, you know, yeah, it's kind of where, okay, they almost felt the need to do something different and stuff. So how can they do it differently? So you know, so rather than like kind of having, you know, Steve Martin, you know, kind of tripping on the globe, is that then they, you know, had it rolling down the street, and it would just kind of show up, you know, like kind of somewhere like, you know, 3 or 4 scenes later or something like that. So I mean, I don't know, like I felt like, you know, I get it, like kind of, you know, like, you know, they wanted to kind of, you know, put an homage and then something that like, you know, for people who are fans of the original that would get and stuff. But then, you know, the net effect though was that like it wasn't funny, you know, kind of, you know, like that's the thing though.
Yeah, I kind of thought, oh, that's clever, and then but it's not funny at all. And
right.
And it is, you know, it's sort of like being beaten up by someone that looks vaguely like an old friend. You know, it's just it didn't really hold much appeal to any true fans of the series. And, you know, there was just, as I say, there's like lots and lots of really bad choices. I mean, they just had him, I get what they tried to do. They tried to make him so over the top French, like he's wearing a beret and he's got a really over ridiculous accent. But it was so over the top, and it just wasn't really funny. It just didn't work. And it was just a shame to see. I just hope they paid Steve Martin a lot of money for that movie, because I just feel really bad for him.
I mean, it's interesting how they recognize, right, that like even though like this is a remake, it's almost in some instance a reboot too, because, you know, unlike the original, that didn't have the Dreyfus character and stuff, they recognized in the heart of the Pink Panther series and stuff was a character who was, you know, the head of the, you know, French police that, you know, wanted to kind of almost, you know, kill Clouseau and stuff like that. So they recognized that comic element. But here he's like scheming, and so like in other words, again, like kind of they saw what was something that worked in the original series, but their way of executing it though was like just, you know, like kind of it was lost, you know, like kind of.
Well, yeah. I mean, they made it about like him kind of trying to, I suppose, rather than being a sort of absurd sort of critique of the elite society, it's kind of focused around the prestige of the chief inspector, and like he was going to be affected by this. But part of what made Herbert Lom's character so funny was that he was so, you know, blatantly angry all the time, and he was just in a complete rage. Right. And, you know, as soon as Clouseau said something, he would just say, "Idiot, get out," and tries to shoot him. Every word, you know, that in itself was really funny. And this is like some weird toned down version who's giving wry smiles at something that's, you know, yeah. And I think what the saddest thing about this is that it was nice in a way to kind of see Steve Martin doing almost stuff that he was doing back in the 80s. And it would almost have just been nice to have forgotten about the whole Pink Panther thing and just had Steve Martin doing something like some sort of new version of what the man with 3 brains or something, you know. If you want to do a remake, at least that would give him, he wouldn't have to do this weird sort of quasi impression of Inspector Clouseau, and he could have just concentrated on the comedy element and his own sort of absurd brand of humor. Yeah. And I mean, the one thing that I mean, again, every joke was punctuated by music, and it was zoomed in on us. It's like, oh, look, da-da-da-da, the pen's leaking in his pocket. And it's like, okay. And I mean, for me, the one hallmark of any really bad, highly manufactured comedy is if it features Yello's The Race,
Hmm.
which if you hear it, you'll know exactly what music it is. It's in every kind of zany chase scene in any bad comedy that's been made in the last 20 years. And lo and behold, it reared its ugly head in this movie as well. So yeah. And the other thing that's totally inconsistent is that somehow, even though he's supposed to be a bumbling idiot who has no idea, he knows all the regulation codes of all the police stuff and manages to figure out who did it at the end. It was just, that's just so out of keeping with the character. It was,
I mean, that's overall, it's this thing of where I think the movie kind of, had some ideas of, what to do and stuff like that, but then, more than just lost its way. And then it ultimately didn't really, know what it was doing, in the sense of like you said, just having that, Scooby-Doo, kind of moment and stuff like that, of like kind of that suddenly, it all comes together, like kind of, it just really I don't know, I really kind of wonder who they thought was the audience, right, and what they ultimately were trying to do. I mean, maybe the idea was kind of what's called something that fans would like and stuff like it, but really how they thought that it's really hard to say. Kind of what parts of it did they think would appeal to a Pink Panther fan?
I mean, I think basically it's this kind of thing of the appeal of Steve Martin. Basically, it's like Steve Martin in something that's a bit like what he used to do.
Right.
Surely it can't be that bad, but it is. Yeah. I'm trying to think if there was I mean, the other thing, you're right. I mean, what's so annoying is that you get from this scene of, them in leotards dancing around stupidly, to him solving the entire case, within, it's almost like they said, right, so we've rolled the dice and come up with this, which is you, Steve, and you, Jean, you have to dance around like idiots and somehow try and please make that funny and save something of this movie. And then you solve the case. It's just like, it's just.
I think for me, what was the comedy there was Jean Reno, kind of being put in that position, I guess imagine, kind of, selling it to him, okay, this is what you have to do, stuff like that. And I just can imagine that conversation, kind of being told, what he had to do. And the fact that he went along with it, kind of, it's probably okay, kind of, this is almost over, right? So.
Yeah, just give me lots of money and I'll go away and do this for you. Yeah. I mean, the other thing, he was supposed to be kind of like a Kato stand-in character.
Right.
And of course, what was always good about those scenes, not that they're particularly politically correct these days, but Burt Kwok was actually a very good physical comedian. And those scenes, are just really fun to watch because they're just really, really well done. And this was just like him punching him whenever, and he just goes, good one. And, that's just not funny. There's just nothing about that that's even remotely like the intricate kind of physical comedy scenes that we had in the past. It was, yeah, and
that's something that was, kind of what would made, we talked about the things that worked for the series and stuff, and that was one of the things that worked, was just the fact that any moment, kind of, Kato would just jump out and kind of, spring an attack. And that was partially kind of it kept you as an audience, kind of, a little bit on the edge of your seat, or kind of, wondering when he was going to suddenly pop out and stuff like that. When Peter Sellers would kind of, walk into a room, right, and stuff. And having that kind of tension kind of, was something that really worked in the original. And here, like you said, it's kind of they knew that that's what they wanted to do, but they just definitely kind of, it just, something was lost in the translation.
It's like the script, Clouseau talks to him and then he tries to punch him again, repeat. There was nothing unexpected, nothing surprising about any of that stuff at all. So
So I think I think overall it's pretty clear that like in the list of our like remakes that failed and stuff, this is definitely like another one for that pile that keeps getting higher and
Higher and
higher.
higher, yeah. I mean, I would say this is, in terms of, the most heinous of remakes, this is
No.
definitely, from a personal perspective, this is my number one. I think this is really so personally offensive, this movie, that it tops the list, really. Even worse than the Rollerball remake. I think that was like my number one before this, but yeah, this was
Interesting.
definitely yeah. But of course they did make, and I'm sure it made money, of course, because it's got
Oh, of
Steve
course.
Martin and Beyonce, and yeah, I'm sure some people went and watched it just for the hell of it, and I'm sure it probably got, unfortunately, I mean, they made a sequel, so it must have made
Yes.
money.
Yep.
So I guess at some point we can do a Shot in the Dark versus Pink Panther 2 or Return of. We can put ourselves through that again. So yeah, I can't think of anything. I mean, I can obviously think of more negative things to say about the new. Actually, there was one thing that I thought was kind of a vaguely clever joke, and that was what they had the Clive Owen as 006.
Yes.
Because of course he was passed over as a potential Bond at one time.
Oh,
So
right.
people were talking to him. So that was
Kind of an
that was
inside
one
joke.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't think about that.
Yeah, that was, apart from that, all I can think of is just ranting negative things, really. Yeah. Enjoy.
Well, coming up, we'll definitely look more forward to the remake versus original of Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, and as well as the different ones for Yojimbo, official and unofficial and stuff. And possibly, we've talked a little bit offline about, Planet of the Apes as a upcoming talk as well. Definitely in light of the current events here and stuff like that. So once again, John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.